Get your hands off that vehicle. Right now. The man didn't even look up from his clipboard when he said it. He just pointed, one finger, casual, like he was directing traffic, at Sylvester Odom, who was standing 3 feet away from the Bentley, not touching it, just looking at it the way any person with 40 years of engine knowledge looks at a car that's clearly been misdiagnosed. Sylvester was 61 years old. He had grease under his fingernails that no amount of soap ever fully fixed. And he was wearing the same kind of work jacket he'd worn since 1987. Dark green, faded at the shoulders, his name stitched above the left pocket in thread that had gone from red to pale orange somewhere around 2004. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there because his daughter had called him in a panic and asked him to come. That's what fathers do. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who decided what you were before you opened your mouth, hit that like button, because this story is going to feel very familiar. Sylvester's daughter, Kezia Odom Farrell, had married into the Farrell name 3 years earlier, and the Farrells had money the way some families have freckles. So many of them, going back so many generations, that nobody remembered a time before it. Her husband, Thomas, was a decent man who genuinely loved her. But Thomas's father, Clifford Farrell, had never quite accepted that his son had chosen a woman whose father drove a 2009 Silverado and rented a duplex in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Clifford didn't say ugly things out loud. He was too practiced for that. He said them with pauses, with the way he looked past Sylvester's shoulder when they shook hands, with the way he introduced him to guests, Thomas's father-in-law. No name, no profession, just a relation, like a piece of furniture that came with the house. Sylvester had noticed. He always noticed. He just didn't say anything because Kezia was happy, and Kezia's happiness was worth more than his pride. The Farrell estate was outside of Chester, about an hour from Halifax, one of those properties that looks modest from the road and then unfolds into something that takes your breath away once you're past the gate. Rolling back field, a dock on the water, a triple garage that was cleaner than most hospitals. Clifford Farrell collected cars, not as a hobby, as a statement. The Bentley Continental GT was his crown. Midnight blue 2019 W12 engine, barely 11,000 kilometers on it. He'd had it flown in from a dealership in Toronto. He talked about it the way other men talked about their children, with a specific kind of pride that had no room for outside opinion. It had stopped starting 2 weeks ago. Not a dramatic failure. No bang, no smoke, no warning lights. It just didn't. You'd turn the key and get a sound like the car was thinking about it, considering its options, and then nothing. The silence of a machine that had made up its mind. Clifford had called 3 people. First, the dealership in Toronto, who walked him through a diagnostic over the phone and concluded, unhelpfully, that the car needed to be seen in person. Second, a specialty shop in Halifax that worked exclusively on European imports. They'd sent a technician named Brett, who'd spent 4 hours with the car, replaced the battery terminals, charged him $680, and driven away without fixing anything. Third, and this is where things got tense, he'd called a firm out of Dartmouth called Coastal Prestige Automotive, which had a waiting list and a reputation that made Clifford feel important just by being on it. That was Raymond Osei's firm. Raymond Osei had been running Coastal Prestige for 11 years. He was 44, built like someone who had actually worked on engines rather than just supervised people who did. And he had a diploma from NSCC and a shelf of certifications that required periodic renewal because the cars kept getting more complicated. He wore pressed shirts to client meetings. He drove a Land Rover. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most qualified person Clifford Farrell could have called. Clifford had called him because a friend recommended him, and because the name sounded prestigious enough. He had not known, until Raymond walked through the garage door, that Raymond was a black man. Raymond knew the second he saw Clifford's face shift, just slightly, just a fraction, that the job was going to be complicated in ways that had nothing to do with the car. He introduced himself. Clifford shook his hand, then immediately turned to Raymond's assistant, a young white man named Parker, who handled the scheduling and carried the equipment, and addressed all subsequent questions to Parker. Parker, to his credit, kept redirecting. Raymond would know better than me. That's really Raymond's area. Clifford kept drifting back, like a compass needle that couldn't help pointing the wrong direction. Raymond examined the car for 90 minutes. Systematic, thorough, no wasted movement. He'd seen the symptom before, that particular hesitation, that specific non-start, and he had a suspicion forming, but he wanted to rule out the obvious before he went looking for the subtle. He asked for the service history. Clifford handed it over with the air of someone presenting credentials. Raymond read it carefully. Then he asked if he could check one specific component, the fuel pump relay, which in this generation of Continental GT had been known to develop an intermittent fault that presented exactly like this, and which Brett from Halifax had clearly not checked because it required removing a panel that looked structural but wasn't. Clifford said, "The last technician already checked the electrical." Raymond said, gently, "He checked the terminals. This is different." Clifford said, "I don't think that's the problem." Raymond said, "I'd like to verify before we rule it out." Clifford said, "And this is the part that mattered. You know what? Let me get a second opinion before we start pulling panels." Raymond waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned patience the way most black men in skilled trades learned it. Not as a virtue, but as a survival strategy. "Who did you have in mind?" Raymond asked. Clifford's answer was to reach for his phone. The call went to his son, Thomas. Thomas, to his credit, immediately said that Raymond was the expert and they should trust his judgment. Clifford said he just wanted to make sure. Thomas, who had learned years ago which battles to pick with his father, said fine. He'd see what he could do. Then he hung up and called his wife. Kezia called her father. Sylvester was at his workbench in the duplex basement, rewiring a fog light assembly for a neighbor's Jeep, when his phone buzzed. Kezia explained the situation in the efficient way she had, not angry yet, just concerned. Her father-in-law had basically dismissed the qualified mechanic her husband had approved. Could he come and just take a look? Not to fix it necessarily, just to be a presence. To maybe confirm what Raymond said so Clifford would have to listen to someone. Sylvester didn't ask why Clifford would listen to him and not Raymond. He already knew the answer. Clifford wouldn't listen to him either, not at first. But Kezia needed him there, so he got in the Silverado and drove to Chester. He arrived to find Raymond still in the garage, sitting on a stool near the equipment case, scrolling through his phone with the particular stillness of someone who has decided not to let a situation cost him more energy than it already has. Parker was leaning against the far wall. Clifford Farrell was standing near the Bentley with his arms crossed, and with him was the man who had told Sylvester to get his hands off the vehicle. A man Sylvester would later learn was called Dennis Harwood, one of Clifford's old golfing friends, who had appointed himself advisor in all things mechanical, despite, as Raymond would quietly note later, knowing almost nothing about cars. Sylvester looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at Sylvester with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally exhausted. "You must be Kezia's father," Raymond said, and stood up to shake his hand. Sylvester owed him. He held Raymond's hand a beat longer than a normal shake. "What are we looking at?" Raymond told him. "Fuel pump relay, intermittent fault. Needed to pull a panel to access it." The symptom pattern matched. The service history supported it, and Brett from Halifax had stopped short of the actual diagnosis. Sylvester nodded slowly. He'd seen the same fault, once on a 2017. He asked if Raymond had done the full draw test on the electrical yet. Raymond said he'd started it but been interrupted. Sylvester made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite anything else. Just the sound of one mechanic recognizing another. Then Dennis Harwood said, from across the garage, "And who exactly are you?" Sylvester said his name again. Dennis looked at the green jacket, the Silverado visible through the open garage door, the worn hands. "This is a very specialized vehicle. I'm not sure what your experience is, but 40 years, Sylvester said pleasantly. Mostly domestic, but I've done enough European to know where to look. Dennis turned to Clifford. "Clifford, I'm not sure we need." Clifford held up a hand. He was looking at Sylvester with an expression that Sylvester recognized, the calculation of someone trying to place him in the correct category. Your daughter married Thomas, Clifford said. She did. A pause. And you work on cars. I do. Another pause. Clifford seemed to be negotiating something internally. The outcome was apparently that a retired mechanic who was family adjacent was marginally more acceptable than a professional he'd called and then distrusted. It was a logic that made no sense except in the world Clifford Farrell lived in, where hierarchy was everything, and the hierarchy ran on signals he'd invented himself. Fine, Clifford said. Take a look. He did not say this to Raymond. He said it to Sylvester. Raymond, to his immense credit, did not react to this. He simply picked up his diagnostic tablet and said to Sylvester, I'll walk you through what I found. There are people who get bitter when they're handed a situation like that. Raymond had every right to be bitter. He was the professional. He was the one who'd been called, driven out, and then, essentially, demoted in favor of a family member who arrived in a 20-year-old truck. What happened in that garage was not fair, and everyone in it who had any sense knew it. But Raymond Osei was not interested in proving a point. He was interested in fixing the car. He walked Sylvester through the diagnostics. Not in a simplified way, in the way you'd walk a peer through your reasoning, checking for gaps, inviting disagreement. Sylvester listened, asked 2 questions, pointed out one thing Raymond hadn't considered, a secondary relay in this generation that occasionally failed in tandem, which Raymond filed away without comment as a genuine insight he hadn't thought of. They agreed on the approach. Raymond would pull the panel. Sylvester would run the draw test on the secondary circuit, while Raymond accessed the primary relay. Dennis Harwood stood near the door with his arms folded and said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say. Clifford watched from the side of the garage, and for the first time since Raymond had arrived, he was quiet. The panel came off cleanly. The primary relay was accessible. A small component, unremarkable to look at, the kind of part that cost $45, and was responsible for whether or not a $130,000 car started in the morning. Raymond examined it, ran his tester across the contacts, showed Sylvester the reading. Sylvester looked at the number. There it is. The relay was faulty. Intermittent resistance across the contacts, exactly as Raymond had predicted, exactly as the symptom pattern suggested. The secondary relay Sylvester had flagged was borderline. Not failed yet, but worth replacing while they were in there. Raymond had the part. Of course he had the part. He'd suspected this before he'd even driven out, and he'd been prepared. He pulled it from the equipment case, held it up briefly, and then replaced the old relay. With the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work so many times that the drama had long since drained out of it. Parker noted everything for the invoice. 2 relays, 1 panel removal, full electrical draw test, documentation of symptom history, diagnostic fee, professional, complete, the kind of paperwork that protected everyone. Raymond said, "You want to try it?" He said it to Clifford. Clifford looked at the key in his hand. Then he got in the Bentley and he turned it over. The engine caught on the first turn. That deep, unhurried W12 sound. The kind of engine note that costs money and sounds like it. It filled the garage and kept going, smooth as anything, no hesitation, no second guessing. Dennis Harwood uncrossed his arms. Clifford sat in the driver's seat for a moment. Sylvester couldn't see his face from where he was standing, but he could see his shoulders, and something in them had shifted. Some tension that had been there since Raymond walked in the door had gone out of them. Clifford got out of the car. He looked at Raymond. He said, "Good work." 2 words, that's all. Not quite enough, and they both knew it. But Clifford Farrell was not a man who had a larger vocabulary for this kind of moment, and Raymond had learned a long time ago that the satisfaction wasn't in the acknowledgement. It was in the fix. The car ran. He'd known it would run. That was enough. He shook Clifford's hand, professional to the last. Then he turned to Sylvester and shook his hand too, and this one had something different in it. Something that didn't need to be named, between 2 men who had each spent decades being the most competent person in rooms that spent considerable energy not seeing them. "Good catch on the secondary," Raymond said. Sylvester shook his head slightly. "You would have found it." Raymond smiled, "Probably, but it was faster with 2. Kezia arrived 20 minutes after the car started. She'd been at the main house with Thomas, waiting. When she walked into the garage and saw her father's expression, she knew it had gone the way it needed to go. Thomas was behind her. He looked at his father, who was still standing near the Bentley with his hand on the roof, the way a man stands near a thing he loves. That briefly scared him. Thomas said, "Everything okay, Dad?" Clifford said, "Fine." Raymond sorted it. He said Raymond's name. First time he'd used it all afternoon. Thomas put his arm around Kezia's shoulders and didn't say anything, which was the right call. There were things in that garage that didn't need to be spoken into a bigger conversation right now. Not in front of Parker, not in front of Dennis. Not while Raymond was packing his equipment case, with the practiced efficiency of a man with 2 more calls to make that day. Dennis Harwood left without saying much. He shook Clifford's hand and made a vague comment about getting on the road. He didn't speak to Raymond. He didn't speak to Sylvester. He walked to his Audi, and he left, and the garage felt cleaner without him. Sylvester helped carry one of Raymond's cases to the van. Unnecessary. Parker could have done it. Raymond could have done it. But it was a reason to walk alongside him for a minute without anyone listening. Does that happen often? Sylvester asked. Raymond didn't pretend not to know what he meant. More than it should, he said. Less than it used to, in some places. About the same in others. Sylvester nodded. He thought about the 40 years. The shops that hadn't hired him until they ran out of other options. The customers who'd asked for the other guy. The ones who'd come back. They always came back, because the work was the work and the work didn't lie, and the ones who hadn't. The slow accumulation of it, which you could either carry or put down, and you had to make that choice again roughly every 3rd Tuesday. You've got a good business, Sylvester said. I do, Raymond agreed. He wasn't being modest or proud about it, just accurate. Took a while. They all do. Raymond put the case in the van, and they shook hands again, and that was it. No speech, no dramatic reckoning. Just 2 men who had done their jobs well, standing on a driveway in Chester, Nova Scotia, in the late afternoon light. That evening, Sylvester drove back to Dartmouth. The Silverado made a noise around the Hubbard's exit that it had been making for 2 weeks. Something in the front suspension, something he kept meaning to look at, and kept not getting to. The way mechanics are always the last ones to fix their own vehicles. He made a mental note that turned into the same mental note it always turned into, which was that he'd get to it on the weekend. His phone buzzed at the next light. Kezia. He answered on the second ring. Thank you, she said. That was thank you. You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to. I want to. He told her the car sounded good when it started. He told her Raymond had known exactly what the problem was before Clifford would let him check it. He told her that. And then he told her something else. He said that Raymond Osei was one of the better diagnosticians he'd come across in a long time, and that if the Farrells had any sense, they'd be calling him for everything going forward and treating him like what he was, which was a professional who knew his work and deserved to be taken at his word. Kezia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thomas is going to talk to his father. Good, I don't know if it'll. I know, Sylvester said. But it's worth saying. He got off the phone before the Tantalon exit and drove the rest of the way home in the particular quiet of a man who knows he did something useful today, even if the thing he did was smaller than it should have had to be. The duplex was dark when he pulled in. He sat in the truck for a moment, listening to the engine tick down. The suspension noise again as he stepped out. Definitely the weekend. He went inside, washed his hands 3 times the way he always did, stood at the sink, looking at the water run gray and then clear, and thought about a W12 turning over on the first try and 2 men shaking hands in the late afternoon on a driveway in Chester. If you've stuck with this story to the end, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to see more stories like this one, real ones, about real people who showed up and did the work anyway, subscribe to Heirloom Tales. There are a lot more where this came from. The car ran. That was enough. And somewhere in Dartmouth, a mechanic with 40 years in his hands, and nothing left to prove, finally got around to making himself a cup of tea.